Magnolia Grand Ballroom, with its grandeur and timeless elegance, gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Rows of impeccably dressed attendees mingled, their laughter and chatter forming a gentle hum that filled the room. It was the annual charity gala for the Youth Horizons Foundation, a cause dedicated to providing opportunities for underprivileged children. The event attracted America's elite, renowned entrepreneurs, celebrated actors, and prominent journalists, all gathered under one roof, united by a shared commitment to make a difference. Near the rear of the ballroom, in a less conspicuous corner, sat 18-year-old Barron Trump. His towering figure, coupled with a calm, introspective demeanor, made him an unlikely focal point amid the lively crowd. Though invited by a family friend, Barron appeared content to remain in the background, his sharp blue eyes quietly observing the bustling room. He wasn't drawn to the spotlight, unlike the other attendees who seemed to thrive in it. Instead, his gaze wandered thoughtfully, taking in every detail: the shimmer of evening gowns, the crisp bow ties, the clink of champagne glasses, and the warm smiles exchanged around him. "Would you care for another drink, sir?" a waiter asked softly, breaking Barron's train of thought. "No thank you," Barron replied politely, his voice calm yet warm. The waiter nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Barron leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly drumming the edge of the table. Though he appeared composed, a faint glimmer of hesitation flickered in his eyes. Events like these were unfamiliar territory for him. He had spent much of his life shielded from the public eye, yet here he was, surrounded by strangers who might see him only through the lens of his family's notoriety. Across the room, the chatter began to quiet. The host, a poised and charismatic woman, took to the stage, her heels clicking softly on the polished wooden floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with a warm smile, "thank you for joining us tonight to support a cause that brings hope to so many young lives. We are honored to have such an incredible group of people here with us this evening." As the applause subsided, Barron glanced toward the stage, his expression unreadable. The evening unfolded smoothly, the string quartet's soothing melodies creating a serene backdrop. Waiters moved with practiced grace, offering trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne. Barron reached for a small glass of sparkling water, the chill of the condensation seeping into his fingertips. His solitude was interrupted by the voice of a middle-aged woman at a nearby table. "Do you think the keynote speaker will stir the pot tonight?" she whispered to her companion, her tone both curious and apprehensive. Her companion, a man in a tailored suit, chuckled. "Oh, I wouldn't put it past them. They're known for pushing boundaries, after all." Barron caught fragments of their conversation but didn't react. His mind drifted back to the purpose of the evening, helping children who might otherwise never have the opportunities he had always taken for granted. The thought made him pause. Despite the opulence surrounding him, he felt a quiet weight settle in his chest, a yearning to one day contribute meaningfully, to be more than just a name associated with his father's legacy. The hum of anticipation grew as the crowd awaited the keynote speaker's entrance. Barron's gaze shifted to the stage as the host returned to the microphone. "And now," she began with a flourish, "it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, a journalist whose sharp insights and fearless commentary have sparked conversations nationwide. Please welcome." Polite applause filled the room as the speaker strode confidently to the podium, their tailored suit impeccably pressed. The journalist's smile radiated charisma, but their eyes betrayed a hint of mischief, a spark that promised a speech as provocative as it was eloquent. Barron's expression remained neutral, though his shoulders stiffened slightly. He had seen how easily public figures could be reduced to caricatures, how words meant to entertain could cut deeper than intended. As the journalist began to speak, they opened with light-hearted anecdotes, eliciting laughter from the crowd. For a moment, the tension eased. Yet Barron sensed an undercurrent, a shift in tone that hinted at something more pointed to come. Unbeknownst to Barron, the evening would soon take an unexpected turn. But for now he sat silently, a quiet figure in a room brimming with personalities, his presence understated yet deeply felt by those who noticed him. Barron, seated in the back, observed intently. His expression betrayed nothing, yet his mind worked quietly. He had seen this kind of performance before, polished, purposeful, designed to captivate. But something about the journalist's cadence hinted at an edge, a sharpness lying just beneath the surface. "Let's start with something light," the journalist continued, eliciting a ripple of laughter with a story about a mishap at last year's gala. They moved seamlessly from one anecdote to another, their charm weaving an easy camaraderie with the audience. Barron noted the way their words danced across the room, drawing people in like moths to a flame. At a nearby table, a woman in an elegant navy gown leaned over to her companion. "They really know how to work a room, don't they?" she whispered. Her companion, a silver-haired man, nodded. "That's why they're so well known. They can turn a simple observation into something unforgettable." The journalist, sensing their command over the crowd, shifted gears. Their tone grew more pointed, their words tinged with irony. "Of course," they said, "we can't talk about the state of the world without mentioning the man who made orange the new black." The quip drew scattered laughter, though some in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Barron's gaze remained fixed on the stage. His fingers lightly tapped the edge of the table, a small, almost imperceptible movement that betrayed his growing unease. He had grown accustomed to hearing his family's name turned into punchlines, but it never ceased to remind him of the distance between public perception and personal reality. The journalist pressed on, their jabs becoming sharper. They critiqued policies, tweets, and public appearances, each comment drawing a mix of laughter and tightened smiles. Barron, sitting alone in the corner, was the picture of composure, though inside, his thoughts churned. "I suppose," the journalist said, their voice dripping with mockery, "we can't forget the next generation. I mean, let's talk about Barron." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Heads turned toward Barron, who remained seated, his face calm but unreadable. The spotlight, both literal and metaphorical, had landed squarely on him. "Imagine growing up in a golden tower," the journalist continued, their tone playful but cutting, "surrounded by marble everything, while your dad tweets about coffee at 3 a.m. That must build character." The attempt at humor fell flat. A few nervous chuckles escaped, but most of the audience sat in stunned silence. The moment stretched, the air heavy with tension. At a nearby table, a man leaned toward his wife. "They've gone too far," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Barron, still motionless, felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. Yet he didn't flinch. His posture remained upright, his expression unwavering. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. The journalist, perhaps realizing the discomfort they had stirred, hesitated for a fraction of a second. They glanced toward Barron's table, their confident smirk faltering ever so slightly. But the moment was brief, and they quickly attempted to regain their footing. "Tough crowd," they muttered into the microphone, forcing a laugh that went unanswered. In the back of the room, a waiter paused mid-step, his tray of champagne glasses trembling slightly as he glanced toward Barron. The young man's stillness seemed to fill the room, commanding attention without a single word. Barron's mind was calm, though a flicker of sadness passed through him. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He had long since understood that people often used humor to mask discomfort, to bridge gaps they didn't know how to navigate. But this wasn't humor, it was something else, something heavier. At another table, an elderly woman in a pearl necklace whispered to her companion, "Why would they single him out like that? He's just a boy." Her companion shook his head. "Because they think it's safe. But they've underestimated him." As the room held its collective breath, Barron sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. The silence grew louder with each passing second, every eye fixed on him. And then, something shifted. Slowly, deliberately, Barron pushed back his chair. The soft scrape of wood against the polished floor was the only sound in the room. He rose to his full height, his tall frame imposing yet graceful. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Without a word, Barron turned and began walking toward the stage. His steps were measured, purposeful, each one echoing in the otherwise silent ballroom. The journalist froze, their earlier bravado dissolving into uncertainty. The crowd watched, their faces a mixture of anticipation and awe. No one knew what Barron would say, but one thing was clear: this young man was about to own the moment. As Barron approached the stage, the atmosphere in the Magnolia Grand Ballroom shifted palpably. The air seemed heavier, charged with a mix of tension and curiosity. Every eye followed his deliberate steps, each movement underscoring the quiet authority he carried. Conversations had ceased, leaving a profound silence that amplified the soft clicks of his polished shoes against the floor. At the podium, the journalists stood frozen, their earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. Their hands gripped the edges of the podium as if seeking stability. Barron's calm, measured pace made the moment feel eternal. Whispers broke out among the audience. "Is he really going to say something?" a man murmured to his wife, his voice laced with disbelief. "I think he is," she replied, her eyes wide with anticipation. When Barron finally reached the edge of the stage, he paused, his tall frame casting a long shadow under the spotlight. His composure was remarkable, steady, deliberate, as though he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, though it was clear he hadn't. He turned to face the journalist, his piercing blue eyes locking onto theirs. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. Barron's face remained neutral, but there was an undeniable weight in his gaze, one that spoke volumes without a single word. The journalist, feeling the gravity of the moment, cleared their throat nervously. "Well," they began, their voice faltering slightly, "I didn't mean to make anyone uncomfortable. It was just a bit of humor." Barron's response was a simple yet profound silence. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, and didn't allow the journalist's words to diffuse the weight of what had been said. Instead, he finally spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Thank you for your insight," Barron began, his tone measured but resolute. The choice of words immediately disarmed the audience and the journalist alike. It wasn't what anyone had expected, a lashing out or a defensive retort, but something far more profound. The journalist blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Oh, well, you're welcome," they stammered, unsure of how to respond. Barron turned his attention to the crowd, his gaze sweeping the room before resting on no one in particular. His voice grew slightly firmer, though it retained its calm, deliberate cadence. "I've spent most of my life being defined by others," he said, his words resonating in the silent ballroom. "People assume they know who I am, what I believe, and how I live. They fill in the gaps with their own stories, stories that are often far from the truth." The room was utterly still. Even those who had initially chuckled at the journalist's jabs now sat motionless, captivated by Barron's presence and the power of his words. "I understand why it happens," he continued, his voice softening slightly. "It's easy to forget that behind every name, behind every headline, is a human being, a person with struggles, dreams, and a story that's far more complex than what you see on the surface." The journalist shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado now completely dissolved. They looked down at the podium, unable to meet Barron's steady gaze. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it was quickly silenced as Barron resumed speaking. "Words have power," he said, his tone carrying a quiet conviction. "They can uplift, or they can wound. They can bring people together, or they can drive them apart. And in moments like these, we have a choice, to use our words to build bridges or to tear them down." Several attendees exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of admiration and reflection. A woman near the front of the room dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, clearly moved by the young man's poise and maturity. Barron turned back to the journalist, his gaze unwavering but devoid of malice. "You may think you know me because of who my father is," he said, his voice steady, "but you don't. And that's okay. What matters is not whether we agree or even understand each other fully. What matters is how we treat one another, especially when it's easier to tear someone down than to lift them up." The journalists swallowed hard, their discomfort evident. "You're absolutely right," they admitted quietly, their voice barely audible over the silence in the room. Barron nodded slightly, acknowledging their words without triumph or satisfaction. "I hope," he said, his tone soft yet firm, "this moment gives us all something to think about." With that, he stepped back from the stage, his tall figure radiating an air of quiet dignity. The room remained silent for a beat longer before a single clap broke the stillness. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into a standing ovation, the applause echoing off the ornate walls. The applause in the Magnolia Grand Ballroom swelled, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very air. Some clapped out of admiration, others out of a sense of redemption, as though Barron's quiet dignity had restored something in the room that had been momentarily lost. The journalists stood at the podium, their hands gripping its edges tightly, their earlier composure reduced to a fragile veneer. Barron, seated now at his table, appeared unmoved by the ovation. He offered a polite nod to those who turned to acknowledge him but made no effort to bask in the moment. His stillness, his refusal to claim the applause as his own, spoke volumes. "Did you see that?" a man whispered to his companion at a nearby table. His voice carried a mix of awe and disbelief. "I did," the woman replied, her eyes still fixed on Barron. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. No anger, no ego. Just truth. Around the room, the murmurs of conversation began to pick up again as the applause died down. Yet the energy in the ballroom had shifted. People who had been laughing just moments ago now wore contemplative expressions. Some avoided meeting each other's eyes, as though embarrassed by their earlier reactions. The journalist cleared their throat, an audible attempt to reclaim the room. "Well," they began awkwardly, "that was certainly unexpected." They forced a smile, but it faltered under the weight of the moment. At a table near the stage, an older woman leaned over to her husband, her voice low. "It's rare to see someone so young carry themselves with such grace," she said, her tone filled with admiration. Her husband nodded. "Grace," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's exactly what it was. Not many adults could have handled that with the same poise." As the journalist stumbled through the remainder of their speech, the room's attention shifted. Conversations began to ripple through the tables, quieter now but deeply reflective. It was as if Barron's words had unlocked something in the collective conscience of the attendees. Barron himself remained quiet, his mind drifting. He wasn't replaying the moment in his head or thinking of what others might say. Instead, his thoughts turned inward. Growing up in the public, I had taught him many lessons, some harsh, some humbling. He had learned to endure the scrutiny, to accept the misunderstandings, but tonight had reminded him of something deeper, the power of words, not just to wound but to heal. At his table, a middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit leaned closer. "I have to say, young man, you've given us all a lot to think about tonight." Barron met his gaze and offered a small smile. "Thank you," he said simply. The man hesitated, then added, "Do you mind if I ask, where did you learn to speak like that?" Barron considered the question for a moment. "I think," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "it's less about learning to speak and more about learning to listen. When you've been on the receiving end of so many assumptions, you start to understand how important it is to really hear people." The man nodded slowly, clearly struck by the young man's insight. Across the ballroom, a woman discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She turned to the person beside her and whispered, "I feel like I've just witnessed something rare. It's not often someone reminds us all of what really matters." Meanwhile, the journalist finished their speech, though the room's energy had irrevocably shifted. They stepped down from the podium with a strained smile, their earlier charisma now replaced by a visible humbleness. As they passed Barron's table, they hesitated. "Barron," they said softly, their voice laced with a mixture of respect and regret. "I owe you an apology. My words tonight, they were thoughtless. I hope you can forgive me." Barron looked up, his expression calm. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." The journalist nodded, visibly relieved, before moving on. As the evening continued, snippets of the moment began spreading across the room. Attendees discreetly checked their phones, finding that clips of Barron's words were already appearing on social media. Captions like "a lesson in grace" and Barron Trump's powerful response accompanied short videos, drawing thousands of likes and comments in real time. At one table, a younger man scrolled through his phone and turned to his friend. "This is going viral," he said, his voice filled with awe. "People are calling it the most powerful moment of the night." His friend nodded, glancing toward Barron. "I believe it," he said. "It's not often you see someone turn an awkward situation into something meaningful, especially with so much grace." As the night wore on, Barron remained quietly reflective. He had no interest in the attention his words might garner, nor did he seek validation for what he had said. For him, the true victory lay in the reminder that even in a moment of discomfort, there was always a choice to rise above. As the evening continued, the Magnolia Grand Ballroom gradually returned to its rhythm of conversation and laughter, though the energy remained irrevocably altered. Barron Trump's words had planted a seed, and it was clear that the attendees were still processing the moment. Some discussed it in hushed tones, while others sat in chew. At a table near the front, a man in his 60s, wearing a crisp black tuxedo, leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, addressing his wife seated beside him, "I've been to dozens of these events, heard countless speeches. But I don't think I've ever been as moved as I was tonight." His wife, elegantly dressed in a silver gown, nodded slowly. "There was something so genuine about him," she said softly. "No pretense, no performance. Just truth. It's a rare thing to see these days." Their conversation was interrupted by the host, who had returned to the stage. Her smile was warm, but there was a new depth to her tone as she addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we close this evening, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've just experienced. Tonight wasn't just about raising funds or celebrating success, it became something more. It became a reminder of the power of grace, humility, and the impact that one voice can have. The audience responded with a ripple of applause, subdued yet heartfelt. Barron, seated quietly at his table, offered a polite smile, though he kept his focus inward. He wasn't seeking the spotlight, nor was he reveling in the moment's attention. Instead, his thoughts were focused on the future and the responsibility that came with having a voice that people listened to. At the same time, conversations in the room began to turn inward. At one table, a woman in her 50s, known for her sharp wit and unfiltered opinions, sighed deeply. "I think we've forgotten how powerful our words can be," she admitted to her companions. "Watching that young man tonight made me realize how often I use my words to cut rather than to heal." A man across the table nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He reminded me of something my father used to say," he said. "Speak as though the person you're talking to carries a heart as fragile as your own." Meanwhile, Barron remained composed as a steady stream of attendees approached his table to offer their thoughts. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, nervously stepped forward. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your words tonight, they really resonated with me. I'm a teacher, and I think your message about kindness and understanding is something my students need to hear." Barron met her gaze with a gentle smile. "Thank you," he replied. "If it can inspire even one person to think differently, then it's worth it." The journalist, still lingering near the edge of the room, observed the interactions with a mixture of humility and introspection. The weight of their earlier remarks hung heavy on their shoulders. Gathering their courage, they approached Barron's table once more. "Barron," they began hesitantly, "I know I already apologized, but I wanted to say it again, and not just to you but to everyone here. I crossed a line tonight, and I regret it deeply. Your response was far more gracious than I deserved." Barron stood, his tall frame adding to the quiet gravity of the moment. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we choose to move forward." The journalist nodded, visibly moved. "I'll be thinking about your words for a long time," they said quietly before retreating back into the crowd. As the evening drew to a close, attendees began to collect their coats and make their way toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. Yet even as they departed, snippets of conversation about Barron's speech lingered in the air. "Did you see how composed he was? Not just composed, wise beyond his years. It's not often someone so young reminds us how to be better." Outside the ballroom, the night was cool and crisp, the stars glimmering above the city skyline. Barron stepped out onto the steps of the hotel, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. He looked out at the bustling city below, the sounds of traffic and distant laughter blending into a symphony of life. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You've made an impact tonight," said the man in the navy suit who had spoken to him earlier. "More than you might realize." Barron turned to him and offered a small smile. "If it helps even one person see things differently, then it's enough." The man nodded, his expression filled with respect. "It's more than enough, Barron. It's rare, and it's important. Don't forget that." As Barron descended the steps and walked toward his waiting car, he felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. The night hadn't gone as he had expected, but perhaps that was the beauty of it. Sometimes, the most powerful moments are the ones we don't anticipate, the ones that remind us of who we are and who we strive to be. The night sky blanketed the city as Barron's car wove through the quiet streets. Inside, he sat in reflective silence, his fingers tracing faint patterns on the window's frosty glass. The events of the evening played over in his mind, not in a way that sought validation, but in a quiet pursuit of meaning. Had he truly made a difference? Was the message he had conveyed strong enough to endure beyond the fleeting applause? His driver, an older man named Richard, broke the silence. "That was something back there, Mr. Trump," he said, his tone a blend of admiration and curiosity. Barron looked up, momentarily startled out of his thoughts. "Thank you, Richard," he replied with a faint smile. "It wasn't something I planned for. I just spoke from the heart." Richard nodded knowingly, his eyes flickering to the rearview mirror. "Sometimes, those are the words that stick with people the most," he said. "I've been driving people to events like these for years, and I can't remember the last time I heard anyone talk about kindness like that." Barron's gaze softened, but he said nothing more, letting Richard's words settle in his mind. The car slowed as it approached his residence, a modest but elegant townhouse tucked away on a quiet street. As the car came to a stop, Richard turned slightly. "Good night, Mr. Trump," he said with a small nod. "And thank you for reminding all of us that words can heal." Barron stepped out of the car, pausing to look back at Richard. "Good night, Richard," he said. "Take care." Inside the townhouse, the space was quiet and warmly lit. Barron shrugged off his coat and hung it neatly by the door before making his way to the living room. A stack of books sat on the coffee table, their titles ranging from philosophy to world history, evidence of his love for learning and introspection. He sank into the plush couch, the weight of the evening finally catching up with him. Reaching for his phone, Barron hesitated. He had avoided social media for most of the night, knowing the digital world could be both relentless and fleeting. But something compelled him to look now, to see how the world had interpreted the evening's events. As he scrolled through the feed, his screen filled with clips of his speech. Snippets of his words, captured by attendees, had gone viral, their captions a mix of admiration and introspection. Barron Trump teaches us all about grace under fire. Words have power, and tonight, we were reminded of that. A lesson in dignity from someone wise beyond his years. The comments beneath the posts ranged from heartfelt to reflective. "I've never been a fan of his family, but tonight, I gained respect for him. This young man just reminded us that kindness isn't weakness. Why don't more public figures talk like this?" Barron's lips pressed into a thin line, his thoughts conflicted. He appreciated the sentiments, but he couldn't ignore the complexity of public perception. Would the attention linger long enough to inspire meaningful change, or would it fade into the background noise of the next day's headlines? Elsewhere in the city, the evening's events continued to spark conversations. In living rooms, coffee shops, and late-night diners, people reflected on what they had seen and heard. For some, it was a moment of catharsis, a reminder that even in a divided world, grace and empathy could still resonate. At a quiet diner downtown, two journalists sat across from each other, their laptops open but untouched. One of them, a young woman with glasses perched on her nose, sighed deeply. "Did you see his speech?" she asked her colleague, gesturing toward her phone. He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I did," he admitted. "And I'll be honest, it caught me off guard. I went in expecting the usual drama, but instead, I got a reminder of why words matter." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "It's not often you see someone, especially someone his age, handle a moment like that with so much composure. It makes you think, how often do we speak without considering the weight of our words?" The man smiled faintly, raising his coffee cup. "To thinking before speaking," he said with a wry chuckle. "To using words wisely," she added, clinking her cup against his. Back in his townhouse, Barron set his phone aside and leaned back on the couch. The soft hum of the city outside was a comforting reminder of the world continuing to turn. He thought of the people he had met that night, the elderly woman who thanked him for his grace, the teacher who wanted to share his message with her students, and even the journalist who had offered a heartfelt apology. He knew he couldn't change the world in one night. But if his words had sparked even a single conversation, if they had inspired even one person to approach others with kindness and understanding, then it had been enough. As he closed his eyes, a sense of quiet fulfillment settled over him. The night had been unexpected, but perhaps that was its beauty. Sometimes, the moments we don't plan for are the ones that leave the most lasting impact. And in the quiet of his home, Barron Trump allowed himself a rare moment of peace, knowing that his words had become a ripple in the vast ocean of human connection, small but meaningful and destined to endure. The quiet hum of the heater filled the room, its warmth a contrast to the cold outside. Barron's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He hesitated for a moment, then rose to answer it. Standing on the threshold was Richard, his driver, holding a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Evening, Mr. Trump," Richard said, offering a warm smile. "Someone at the gala asked me to deliver this to you." Barron took the package, his curiosity piqued. "Thank you, Richard. Have a good night," he said, his voice calm but appreciative. As Richard left, Barron returned to the couch, setting the package on the coffee table. Carefully, he unwrapped it, revealing a handwritten note atop a leather-bound journal. The note read, "Barron, your words tonight reminded me of the humanity we all share. This journal is a small token, a space to continue sharing the thoughts that inspire change. Thank you for your courage. Margaret." Barron's fingers lingered on the journal's smooth cover. The gesture, simple yet profound, brought a faint smile to his lips. He opened it to the first blank page, running his hand over the crisp paper. For a moment, he sat in silence, the weight of the day settling over him like a soft blanket. The gala, the journalist's apology, the unexpected impact of his words, it all felt surreal. Yet beneath it all was a quiet certainty: his words had mattered. Leaning forward, Barron picked up a pen and wrote his first entry in the journal. "Tonight, I learned that even the smallest voice can resonate when it speaks with truth and kindness. Words, when chosen carefully, have the power to bridge divides and heal wounds. If I've inspired just one person to choose understanding over judgment, then tonight was worth every moment." As he closed the journal, a sense of peace washed over him. The night might have ended, but its lessons would continue, carried forward by those who had heard and felt them. This story of Barron Trump isn't just about a young man's grace under fire. It's a powerful reminder for all of us about the importance of kindness, empathy, and the incredible strength of words. In a world where it's easy to tear others down, Barron chose to rise above, using his voice to inspire thought, reflection, and connection. This message is one that resonates far beyond the walls of that ballroom. It challenges us to ask ourselves, how do we use our words? Are we building others up, or are we unknowingly creating division? The courage to speak with kindness, even when faced with criticism, is a lesson we can all carry into our daily lives. If this story moved you, we invite you to like this video and share it with someone who could use this reminder of grace and dignity. By spreading this message, you're helping to amplify a lesson the world desperately needs. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and encourage us to be better. Together, we can create a ripple effect of positive change, one word at a time. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did this story mean to you? Have you ever faced a moment where you chose kindness over conflict? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your words could inspire someone else to see the world differently. Let's keep this conversation going, because when we choose empathy, we choose to make the world a better place. Thank you for being part of this journey.